My name is Gayatri Rao, and I'm the Director for the Office of Orphan Products Development at FDA. My office's mission is to promote the development of products like drugs, biologics, devices, and medical foods for patients with rare diseases. One very common stumbling block in rare disease drug development is that we don't know enough about the natural history of the rare disease being studied. Without having a solid understanding of how a disease progresses and what the disease's natural clinical course is, it becomes very difficult to develop a drug and evaluate whether it is safe and effective. Patients and patient advocacy groups can play a critical role in developing this vital information because they're motivated, well-organized, and have a strong network within the patient community. Typically, the only thing that prevents organizations like patient advocacy groups from conducting a natural history study is funding. To help fill this gap, I'm very excited to announce that my office will be launching a new grant program to fund targeted rare disease natural history studies that will meaningfully inform and guide product development for rare diseases, whether it be the development of drugs, biologics, devices, or medical foods. The program is generally open to all applicants, including patient advocacy groups, academicians, and industry. We plan to fund studies with the best scientific merit, which can include prospective studies, retrospective studies, and survey-type studies. More information about this new grant program, along with contact information, can be found on our website at www.fda.gov/orphan. In conjunction with the launch of our new Natural History Grant Program, we have developed the following webinar to provide some basic information about natural history studies, what they are, why they're important, and how you as a patient or a patient advocate can make a real difference.
Hi, my name is Richard Klein. I'm the Director of the Patient Liaison Program at the Food and Drug Administration's Office of Health and Constituent Affairs. Our office is the primary point of contact for patients and patient advocacy organizations. And it's my pleasure to be the moderator for this important discussion on natural history studies for rare diseases. I'm joined in the studio by Tim Frost, a patient with Alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency. Gail Green is a caregiver for family members with von Hippel-Lindau syndrome. Dr. Teresa Strong is Director of the Research Programs at the Foundation for Prader-Willi Research, and from the Food and Drug Administration's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, Dr. Andrew Mulberg, Deputy Director of the Division of Gastroenterology and Inborn Errors Products, and Dr. Jonathan Goldsmith, Associate Director for the Rare Diseases Program. Welcome, everyone. I think probably the best place to start is the definition and the expansion of what is a natural history study. Jonathan, probably you're the best person to answer that question.
Thanks. Well, natural history study is a well-designed, well-thought-out, and well-planned attempt to learn about what happens to people who are affected by a particular specific rare disease. So you try to collect data that really is obtained early in the course of the disease, later on in the course of the disease when people may become symptomatic, when they may actually progress to have symptoms, and without intervention they might get better spontaneously, they might not get better, or they might die from the disease. So a natural history study is trying to capture people at all those different parts of time in a way that uses uniform medical terms so that the information can be used later on by scientists and investigators, as well as by people at the Food and Drug Administration. When they begin to look at drug applications, they can understand this information.
So is that different than a patient registry?
Yes, I think it is. A registry could be very simple and straightforward, like, for instance, a list of names and emails, so that a stakeholder organization, a patient advocacy group that was trying to build up its organization might create a registry like that. It tells you a lot about people potentially who are interested in learning more about the disease or being part of a large organization. But it doesn't give you much information about the disease process. A lot of registries are collected from health records, and health records are now broadly available, lots of electronic mechanisms for us to get data from, and they're not necessarily aimed at your specific rare disease and the information that we need to get about your specific disease. So registries kind of fall down in some of these areas. Even though they're well-intentioned as a source of information, they may not have the kind of information that really supports critical scientific judgments that have to be made about what goes on with your disease. Registries can also be collected as a part of clinical care again. And so a lot of the information is fragmentary. And again, it's not really a robust scientific database, which I think is what clinical investigators, patient advocacy groups, and regulators all want out of having a natural history study.
So just to try to put it in some kind of context, Andrew, at FDA is very concerned with the outcome of clinical trials. And I know that natural history studies would feed into clinical trial studies. Can you talk about how they contribute and how they set up endpoint selection, for example?
Sure. I do want to also supplement Jonathan's comments about registries first, in that there are some good examples of registries that have been developed through clinical care that have been standardized, that have been useful. To Dr. Goldsmith's point about being useful for scientific investigations. And the example, of course, that comes to mind is the Cystic Fibrosis Registry, which has been a prime example, a model for many, which has used declaration of clinical care attributes in a very standardized way, as Dr. Goldsmith has pointed out, to be critical and has been useful for us to be able to be part of the drug development process. With regards to natural history studies, as you point out, natural history studies are an important component, almost a prerequisite before a drug development program should be initiated for a rare disease. A natural history study is critical to be able to serve in a non-interventional way, provide an understanding of how that disease manifests in children, adults, in the patient population of interest, and is critical for the investigation to understand how we can assess the potential impact of future therapeutic agents. As you point out, outcome assessments are important to understand how they can be developed through the process of what patients are suffering from, and that can be gleaned from a longitudinal natural history study.
So we know in rare diseases, by definition, really you don't have a lot of patients to work with in clinical trials. Can a natural history study serve as a control group?
With the proper considerations and understanding of what's required, a natural history study can potentially serve as a historical control, but it requires strict attention to the issues that Dr. Goldsmith and I and you have just talked about, which is the attention to matching populations and to strictly ensuring that the data collected will be of value in a statistical and regulatory sensitive manner to be served as a historical control.
One of the problems with historical controls is that the way that the data was collected and the era when it was collected may be quite different from what contemporary medicine is all about. For instance, diagnostics may have been different 10 or 15 years ago. Supportive care may be quite different at that time. The actual potential treatment availabilities. So that a historical control is not always the best control for what's going on. I would think that the best way to do a natural history study is to have a prospectively planned trial and to collect the data so that it's contemporaneous, it's all collected from the same people at the same time when hopefully the standard of care is pretty uniform, and that it moves forward in time to see what the impacts are of your intervention potentially, or to learn just what the background pace of the disease is.
Teresa, I know that you've been involved in these types of studies, and can you talk a little bit about what the patient advocacy or patient role is in recruiting and retaining people, and how these studies are affecting patients who participate?
Yeah, I think it's important for patients to be involved in all aspects of the study, and that helps with recruitment and retention, because if patients feel ownership and they understand how the study is important to them, important to people in the community. I think in rare diseases we have some very strong community. And so once patients understand how the data is going to be used, why it's so important, why it's important as you're planning drug interventions, even if there's not a drug on the horizon, how getting that information will help develop good clinical trials and allow those trials to go more efficiently, then I think people are very motivated. I think we have to keep in mind, though, that even in a very motivated population, a population that's committed to seeing research moving forward, in many rare diseases, families are overwhelmed with the consequences of the rare diseases. So they have doctor visits, they have therapy visits, they have things that have to go on at the schools. So it's important for the patient advocacy groups to give them a lot of opportunities to be involved, to come back if they're overwhelmed with medical things now, maybe 6 months from now they won't be overwhelmed, to share data with them as we move along, to keep them engaged and motivated to see the study through.
And Tim, I know you've been a participant in a natural history study, and so you're very aware of the role of institutional review boards in the conduct and making sure that people know what they're getting into. Right. But there are, I think, in addition to the importance of informed consent, there are things that people should expect that are unexpected. Maybe you can talk a little bit about your experience.
Absolutely. I will first sort of echo what Teresa said, the importance of the patient advocacy groups. Our Alpha-1 antitrypsin organization, the Alpha1 Foundation, is very active in reaching out to patients to get them motivated, to help them understand what studies may be out there, to include natural history studies. Among the benefits that we all see, particularly in my disease, is the role of the basic science that had been done for Alpha-1 antitrypsin lung disease. And many people, to include working with NIH and FDA in the 80s, resulted in successful therapies to stabilize our lung disease. Now we're all being called upon to look at the Alpha-1 antitrypsin liver disease to help researchers understand, as Dr. Mulberg said, what are the mechanisms in this disease? How do we understand disease progression? So I'm involved in a 5-year natural history study to look at the progression of disease over 5 years. And when you Richard, when you talk about unexpected, that's very important for patients going into a natural history study. It starts with simple things like how much paperwork, how many forms, how many questionnaires, how much research do you have to do to understand your family history. Is the center close to home or not? Do I have to travel? Is that travel going to be reimbursed? Will I have to stay longer than expected? You have to socialize all of these kinds of things with the natural history study coordinator and with the principal investigator. In my case, actually had a complication in that a part of the first year of the study was to have a liver biopsy. Now, I have hyperinflated lungs, and unfortunately, in the course of the liver biopsy, my right lung got punctured, which then caused me to suffer a deflated lung. I didn't know that until I arrived at home. The center was in the middle of America. I flew home to Washington, D.C., my home, and when I got back to the ground, I realized that I was having a hard time breathing. But the benefits of these studies are very great, and in fact, even for me, as a patient, one of the conditions of this study is the patient gets all the results back. So I am taking those results to my medical community so they have that data to help them as they work with me. And then in my case, I reported back to the study my situation, shared with them the data that I got from the hospital, so they now have included that as an adverse result of their work and have put in protocols that will be attentive to the possibility of a pneumothorax being created. So they've taken that back into the feedback for this study.
It was interesting for me to hear about the natural history study that you're in, because I mostly fill out forms and surveys for my husband and daughter. I do a lot of it online, most of it online. And we, biopsies, doctor visits as part of the study are not something that we're accustomed to, just lots of forms. And I'd say that for us, the most complicated part so far has been trying to get films or CDs over images, to be part of the study. That's been the hardest part. Maybe in the future there might be, tissues or something like that that become part of the study, but right now we haven't had to make special trips.
We've been talking about natural history studies as if they're a single animal, but I guess there's different types of natural history studies that are appropriate for different purposes in different places. Can we talk a little bit about the differences in the types of studies and when they're most appropriate?
When you think about different kinds of natural history studies, I don't know if we emphasize this enough, but there's basically, there are kind of three ways to do it. You can do a prospective study, you can do a retrospective study, or you can do what I think of as a snapshot study. So a prospective study is one that's formally organized and begins to collect data from a certain point in time and goes forward for whatever the period of time of collection that you want to learn about the natural history, probably measured in years. The retrospective we talked about in terms of trying to gather information that's already collected, perhaps in medical charts or other kinds of documents that may exist, and to try and see if that can be used against the current standards, what's going on. And then the snapshot is trying to, this is not what really happens, but I was thinking about if you gathered everybody with a particular rare disease in the room on a given day, then they would be at all different stages of the disease. And you would basically get information about each of them and their perception of their disease and how they feel and function and survive with the disease. And you would get that information across a whole group of people. And that would give you some insights in terms of what happens over the passage of time as people are affected by these rare diseases. They become more symptomatic. But it's not as good as following an individual longitudinally, where you actually know specifically what happened to that person at all these different data points.
So who actually conducts these studies? Who's responsible for funding them, for conducting them, and assessing them?
I mean, I know with VHL, our advocacy group administers and possesses that data, and funding is an issue that we talk about in the group. We're a rare disease, so it's a small group, and fundraising is something that's difficult, and the administration does require funds, but we do it all ourselves.
So Gail, you basically initiated the study and funded it and designed it as well?
Right, the VHL Alliance did that, and they continue to validate the data as it comes in. They do that. Personally, I just fill out the surveys, but the group does that.
And that's what we've done with Prader-Willi syndrome as well. But it does take involving the experts in the field, and especially for many rare diseases, there's many systems that are affected. So, going to the experts and engaging them and developing the right questions to ask is critical, and looking at the data as it's coming in and continuing to refine is also important. But funding is an issue, and we too have funded through grassroots fundraising efforts, and it's just been a priority for our community to do that, but it is always a challenge to have the adequate funding.
So as the people who look at these studies afterward and use them in assessing drug applications, do you find that there's different styles or different designs of studies that work or don't, or there's missing information, or things that advocacy organizations and others who do these studies should be aware of prospectively before they actually begin designing a study?
First of all, the FDA has a critical role working with the companies to help engage the patient groups and the academic physicians involved in the care of these children and adults. Without the engagement of the academics who are the experts, I think the patient groups are not going to be able to accomplish the task. We are very eager to work with patient groups through our patient engagement responsibilities, also with the companies who have a very important role to engage the patient groups. But ultimately, the burden of collection of these data, in my mind, in my opinion, needs to involve the academics early and really needs to be a global effort. As I think we've talked about already, these are diseases that are not just centered in the United States. And I would be curious to understand how my colleagues in the patient engagement area have addressed that concern about a global disease that just doesn't affect, U.S. children and adults. But to answer your question, there are often deficiencies in what comes to us, not by the fault of anyone, but it really becomes an issue at the stage of when it's initiated. Often natural history studies are not started early enough in the process of drug development, which then causes companies and others to expedite often collection of data that is necessarily insufficient. But we thankfully have wonderful examples in our legion of drugs that we've approved that have done it very well and serve as very good models for others to follow.
So natural history studies, at least the way I think about it, is that you should begin to initiate these very early in the drug development process. It's, a lot of firms wait until they're ready to do their definitive, what's called phase 3 trial, and then they want to go out and start to do this. Well, it takes a few years to get together some natural history data, and they've kind of moved past the point where they have time available to do these studies, and that creates a problem. If they'll move it back in the drug development process, once you have a candidate drug, for instance, something that has gone through some testing by basic scientists and information is known about potential mechanisms of action, the kind of infrastructure of science that we look for drug development. At that point in time, I think that the firm that's doing the development or the patient advocacy group, if they're doing drug development, because we're beginning to hear about that as well, it's time for them to really build some bridges from the developer to the scientific community so they can understand more about what happens with this disorder clinically to different people. And if it's not a patient advocacy group that's actually doing the work, then that's the time for the firm to reach out, to make connections to the people who are actually the key stakeholders in this whole process, because they will be able to help you understand what's meaningful to them, what's clinically meaningful to patients and families who are affected by this disease. And they'll also be able to help the firm as they move into early testing where they want to recruit subjects. And they'll be able to identify people who are willing to participate as research subjects in studies. And they'll be able to help in terms of other ways, in terms of maybe retention in studies. Sometimes the resources from stakeholder groups can pay for things like taxi cabs, which sometimes make a difference. Get a person from point A across town to point B, where the clinical center is. It's a big deal. It's hard to do for some people. So they can play really important roles that way. They can also help think about trying to keep the studies as open as possible. And just to explain that a little bit, when you design a study, you usually have what are called inclusion and exclusion criteria. Inclusion criteria, kind of the people you want to bring into a trial, and the exclusion, people you want to keep out because maybe they have other complicated diseases. It would be hard to understand what's going on with the disease that you're really interested in. But a lot of these rare diseases are very complex, and to not include really a broad spectrum of people who are affected early in the game, I think it's a place where the firms fall down. They don't really get the full dimension of the natural history. And if they'll pay attention to that earlier in the drug development process, I think that they'll have a much easier time of it as they move through sequential phases of drug development.
There's a lot in what Jonathan has offered here, and I do want to comment on a couple of issues. One, which to underscore the criticality of the initiation of this and the involvement of the patient engagement groups, that currently 7,500 or so of these diseases have been characterized to some degree. Many of them, if not the greatest majority, don't have therapeutic agents targeted to development of these diseases. This is the time that those physicians involved in the care of these children, adults, affected people needs to be initiated. And not when the time of a drug is currently in a vial ready for human testing. In I think our experience, that's when, I think as Dr. Goldsmith has stated, it's often too late and often results in trying to expedite programs without full understanding of the breadth of the heterogeneity of the way these diseases present themselves differently in children versus adults. The issues that you're talking about drawbacks, the drawbacks are not getting started early enough. And of course, I'm oversimplifying my role because I'm not paying for these studies and I'm not coordinating them. So I'm not underestimating the critical importance of all of that, but it doesn't lessen, to me, the criticality of doing it now, of getting things started. And then when the science comes to bear and a brilliant scientist comes and says, I have a drug that I want to test, we can accomplish expediting the pathway, eventually, hopefully, to a drug approval. And you've asked for examples. Well, you know, two examples, and there are numerous, that have used natural history studies, I think, successfully, and historical controls. One is a life-threatening disorder called lysosomal acid lipase deficiency that can present very severely to fatal outcomes in newborns, presenting with swelling of their body and low proteins and liver failure. Babies often will die less than the first year of life. And this is a disease which is extremely rare, with a disease prevalence of less than 1 in a million, 1 in 5 million. Yet a therapy has been developed for the treatment of this disease, predominantly in the infant and older child form, which is much less severe, called sebelipase or Kanuma. But for the historical control developed for the infant approval of the indication relied upon survival analysis. And in this case, this was a fatal disease that there was ability to identify a very large number of a very severely affected number of infants. Of course, we're talking about a small population, but was extremely useful for the approvability of the indication in infants. They used historical control data based on survival and growth failure. So that is, to me, one of the best recent examples that we've had. Another recent example is one for a very rare disease that causes very brittle bones in infants and children and adults that comes in various forms. But understanding how this disease that affects brittle bones, called hypophosphatasia, impacted the way a child will walk, was able to be assessed retrospectively in a large way to be able to help the approvability of this drug, Strensiq, for this indication. So these are just two examples of a slew that we have been gracefully been able to approve, not in our division only, but in the FDA to develop treatments for rare problems.
And it seems like without that kind of information that's generated by these studies, particularly if they've started early, it would be very hard to tease out what the effect of a proposed drug really is, because you don't know what the arc of the underlying disease progression would look like, depending on age, stage of disease, all kinds of environmental factors that might impact them. So they're very, very important studies to get done, and to get done early so that you have a basis for assessing the effect of a proposed drug. And Gail, you were talking about funding and fundraising, and I don't know if you can talk a little about what does it take to get one of these studies off the ground, and how do you get the funds to pull it off?
Right, so in our organization, it was something that we talked about for years. For a long time, we talked about developing a registry and a natural history study, and I think for a while we were just too small to fund it and to have the manpower to even meet with other experts to help. And I think that we got to a point where we were just large enough to support the enterprise and to do more fundraising. And it is very grassroots. It's a grassroots effort to do the fundraising. And then we got to a point where NORD also consulted with us. And I wasn't really a part of that whole process. But I just knew that I think it took a point in our organization where we were large enough to support it.
And you mentioned NORD. I know that NORD and organizations like NORD Genetic Alliance, for example, do make available platforms that organizations can use to collect and analyze this information and get you off the ground, I guess.
That helped us start, but I know there was a lot of work within the organization beyond that too, and there continues to be.
There's a lot of different platforms, and I think it's really important for patient groups to do their homework about the different platforms. And there's many very good platforms, but they are different. And so depending on the kind of data that you want to get, the flexibility that you need, the level of support you need, whether, who's going to own the data, all of these issues are different across the different platforms. So it is a lot of work, but I think it's, especially when these things are initiated by the patient groups, it's worth going out there and finding this information about the available platforms. And a lot of times that's networking with people at various meetings through these umbrella organizations like NORD or Genetic Alliance, as you've mentioned. But really looking at that very carefully before you kind of jump in, it's really worth that effort.
Right. And Teresa raised what I think is a really interesting point of who does own that data. How do you parlay that data with companies, with FDA? And the other thing that came to my mind is confidentiality. How do people get assured of confidentiality? Because they're probably providing a lot of very personal and identifiable information.
And that's where, again, it's really important to understand the platforms, because there's different levels of that and different levels of sophistication of that. And not only to understand the platforms, but then to be able to communicate that back to your patient community so that everybody in the community understands, what are, how is the data secured, what level of protection, those kinds of issues. So, it's very diverse out there, and people need to look at that very carefully, I think, and communicate that well.
And in the case of the Alpha1 Foundation, we have a fairly mature organization and process. So we do have a medical committee and a research committee, so that we're constantly looking at and partnering with the medical community to look at where are the areas that we need to put our research emphasis. And many of the sort of Alpha1 experts across the country, as Dr. Mulberg said, the international aspect of bringing in Alpha1 communities from overseas also into, I'll call the brain trust, and where do we need to put our money. And we generally try to continue to fund foundational science on all aspects of Alpha1 antitrypsin deficiency. What more can we learn about this disease that may translate later in translational therapy? And then we also look at where can we put funding for clinical research to help develop therapies. We also have what we call a philanthropic venture capital company that also puts funding, and this is a for-profit company, that puts funding into companies that are developing potential therapies that will benefit the Alpha1 antitrypsin community. So we try to develop, I'll call it a palette of research, and then we use our national conferences, we have regional conferences, our patient support groups around the country to encourage Alpha1 patients to be involved in whether it's a national history study, whether it's a clinical study. And we have, as both Gail and Teresa have discussed, we have very motivated patient communities that want to participate and want to participate in the hope that it may help them, but on the promise that it will help also those who follow, the future children that are born with our rare diseases. How can we help them?
So you mentioned, collecting this information and learning as you go along. Have you changed the natural history study as you've gone to accommodate things that you're learning? And are there places in FDA that patient advocacy organizations can go, or anybody can go, to get advice on when and how and whether they should be doing that?
Yeah, I don't have an answer to the question whether what we've found it has changed the course of the study yet. I think we've had the first round of patients, and that's a really good question that I would want to ask the principal investigator. After the first round, are they going to change how they do things? Have they found results in the first year interim that have surprised them?
And does FDA offer advice?
I'm sure Jonathan can answer this more completely, but I will offer that I was curious as to whether you all have approached the FDA through the stages of developing your registry/natural history studies to get counsel and to ensure that data collection was being done in the most rigorous way, to kind of preclude some of the problems that often face, that data are often collected and then unfortunately without proper consultation with us, which I think we as a division, and I'm sure throughout the FDA, through the Center for Drug Evaluation Research, for the divisions that do manage rare diseases, I believe I would speak on their behalf saying we'd rather hear from the patient engagement groups who are doing this innovative work early in the process and offer the assistance that I know Dr. Goldsmith can expand upon, because we want to prevent problems on data collection that isn't as useful as it could be.
Yeah. I think there are multiple potential layers for consultation within the Food and Drug Administration. And so the Rare Diseases Program that I'm the Associate Director of within the Office of New Drugs, we meet with people who do drug development, whether they be from the corporate side or sometimes from the stakeholder side, to try and help them address some of these issues early in the game, to try and make sure that their understanding of what's probably needed down the road is a good understanding. So informal consultations. We usually also try and bring people to these meetings from the review divisions. So if your disease happens to affect, let's say, a neurological problem, we have the people from that particular product review division come, and they can speak in that kind of a format. FDA has a cooperative agreement with the National Organization for Rare Disorders to use for NORD, which is what it's known as, for them to use their registry platform to try and create some new natural history studies for as many as another 10 or maybe 11 different disease-affected groups. And they have an application process, actually, that's ongoing now. But there's this cooperative agreement was the result of interactions between NORD and the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research.
Jonathan, can you tell us a little bit about the critical path innovation meetings that FDA has been holding?
Yeah, I think this is a very important kind of interaction between the Food and Drug Administration and regulated industry that's been going on for several years now. And I think it's reached a fairly mature stage. These are discussions not about the development of a particular drug, but they're about technology and science. And so, but those techniques of technology and science are things that actually often result in new drugs. They're part of the infrastructure. They range from things like measurement of a particular substance in a human to actually different classes of drugs that may interact with the human genome in a certain way. And it's a chance for FDA investigators or scientists to speak with scientists from regulated industry in a very open and interactive way, because sometimes there are important questions of a regulatory nature we need to have answered, and they may actually have the wherewithal to do that, and vice versa. We may have the scientific basis to answer issues that they're interested in that really pertain to the broad area of drug development, not to a particular product at all.
And how do people find out or initiate those meetings? Would they go to the FDA website, for example?
Office of Translational Sciences, OTS, within the Food and Drug Administration, organizes those meetings. And there's a formal process. There's an application process, and then there's an arrangement process, and then it's held as a face-to-face meeting at the FDA facilities in Silver Spring, Maryland.
So Jonathan, can patient advocacy organizations access those critical path innovation meetings to talk to FDA about natural history studies?
Yeah, I think that's a very appropriate use of the mechanism. I didn't emphasize that enough, but it's certainly an avenue that people could explore. I would encourage the stakeholder organizations to seek that out.
We've talked about how 7,500 rare disease have been isolated. Not all of them have patient advocacy organizations. How does a group that wants to coalesce learn how to navigate the FDA labyrinth? How do we plug into it? I mean, this is probably the 5th engagement I've had with FDA. I have no idea what your wiring diagram looks like, how I would find out that there are these meetings that I can go to, or I can find someone who can help review my natural history study design. How do I navigate?
Boy, what a great question, because our office, the Office of Health and Constituent Affairs, has a website, which is the For Patients website at www.fda.gov. And on that website, we list all the upcoming meetings that people can participate in. We list the opportunities for comment. So not very many people read the Federal Register every day, but actually we go through the Federal Register, pick out things that are important to patients, and list them so you know when meetings are coming up and when public comment is being sought. But the office itself is a point of entry for you to come in. We're happy to meet with people, talk about how FDA is put together, how it's arranged, and how we can set meetings up for patients and advocates to talk to people at FDA and learn what's the best approach for moving forward.
And we've engaged the FDA as a patient group several times, and it's always been very responsive. And we've invited FDA to some of our meetings, and many have come, and it's been very good. But we do usually go through your office.
Mm-hmm. So from the patient advocacy perspective, one of the things I'm wondering is you guys have all had experience with natural history studies. And are there pitfalls, challenges, things that you think you've encountered along the way that would be helpful for people who are following down that same path? Things that would smooth the path out a little bit by not having to make the same mistakes that might have been encountered in never having done it and trying to create a natural history study?
I can comment from the perspective of somebody who's provided data as a caregiver, more than on the development side. But it is a time-consuming process to go through as a patient or caregiver. And I think that if an advocacy group makes that clear, but also makes it clear to patients and caregivers that they can provide a little bit of data at a time. I always like to say, don't let the great be the enemy of the good. Mm-hmm. You can do a little bit at a time. If there's a question that's difficult to answer, you can skip it and come back. I think that would be helpful. I know with our study, there are follow-ups where you fill out the same questionnaires at intervals. And those questionnaires are the same questionnaires you've filled out in the past, but they don't have the information that you've put in. And I think they were designed that way so that people would not be tempted not to think about the questions and not to update them, but it's extra time consuming and frustrating at times. So those are the pitfalls from my perspective, but I'm not developing the survey.
I think we hear that, and we've heard that a lot. I mean, one thing we really learned was that our patients are really committed, our families are, but it is really hard, and we want to make it as easy as it can be for them. So we want to give them multiple avenues to complete these long surveys, which they're going to complete. So, and not everybody is so well versed in what a consent is and what an assent is. So our individuals with PWS oftentimes have intellectual disabilities, so there's an assent process in addition to the consent. And people don't know that much about that, and it can be complicated. So we learned pretty quickly that we needed multiple ways to communicate that to the families. So we made a video that will walk you through the process of the consent and assent and registration. And we have a downloadable document. And we set up a Facebook page, a closed Facebook page, so people could, if they wanted to, join it and then ask questions if they had questions that popped up. And we have webinars where you can call in. So we've tried to make multiple ways for people to be drawn in and encourage them along the way, because sometimes we can, which is nice, do some of the surveys, but not all of them, but then bringing them back to complete the surveys is the challenge, so keeping people motivated. So if you put a lot of thought into that at the front end, making it as easy as possible for people to complete these natural history studies, whether they be surveys on the web or whether they be going to a clinical place and doing a trial, and get the patient input on how to make that as easy. I think it's a huge plus for getting things done.
Yeah, I think that communication is very important. I think having the patient advocacy organization with patients work with a principal investigator in the design phase is really important to make sure that everyone understands what's needed, how it's needed, what the impact is on a patient, rather than having any particular party going off into their own little cubby, but have everybody looking at that. Can that questionnaire be done in a phased way? Can the clinical work be done close to home, or do you have to travel? Are important issues. And as I always say, is provide feedback to that patient, keep them motivated, and even rewards. Even if you say, God, you really did a really great job on that questionnaire. That was very, very helpful to us. So there's a feedback loop, so that all of it is to engage your patient community, to help them help the principal investigator have a successful study, do all those things that we've talked about, build that foundational science, and then be able to take the next steps into development of drugs and therapy. If we can, as patients, see that continuum, we will be highly motivated and keep that feedback loop going. It's very, very important.
One point that has been brought up to some degree, but I think is worth discussing a little bit more, is the diversity issue. I think we want a good representation of our disorder, and we're thinking of diversity in all sorts of ways. So obviously ethnic and racial diversity, socioeconomic diversity, but also age diversity, because like many rare diseases, our disorder in children is very different and sometimes opposite of what it is in adults. So we want to make sure we're reaching both parents of young children who are often more engaged, and then parents of older children who may be a little bit harder to reach. And then the entire spectrum. So kids who are doing really well may not be as engaged in the patient advocacy community because their kids are doing really well. And kids who are doing really poorly may have so many medical issues that they're not as engaged as well. So I think from the patient advocacy group, it's very important to keep that in mind as you're developing these strategies to reach out into the population. Social media is great, but it really is a skewed population compared to your entire patient population. So thinking of different ways to be reaching the very diverse patient population, educating people why it's important to see the most difficult cases as well as the best case scenarios, so that we can really understand the full spectrum of the natural history.
I think Teresa's point is critical in that we have to understand the way this disease presents, both from the youngest of child to the eldest of adult. Without understanding that, I don't see, or at least from our experience, that's when the interpretability of the data from a certain discerning a drug effect on an outcome is very difficult to make. And then trial design becomes even more important and critical. So I think the point that Teresa should be underscored is that getting as much information about the disease, understanding what it's doing to every patient that one can gather. And again, I would like to just reiterate, and I'm trying to understand about how patient groups try to recruit potential participants in the study, because that in itself could be a biased population. So I'm curious to know how you engage, what is your scope and breadth of reaching out to your population?
You know, we took the low-hanging fruit first, right, through social media, which is great and was very effective. But now we're doing the harder work, which is going through clinics, going through local support groups, you know, reaching out we're trying out a bunch of different ways through residential homes that specialize with people with Prader-Willi syndromes. So we're in that sort of phase of just testing out ways, but we realized pretty quickly that we were getting a wonderful population, but not a representative population.
I think finding those patients who are asymptomatic is so important. What makes that patient not present those symptoms? That may be a pointer towards therapies or drugs. I mean, we have the same issue with the Alpha-1 liver disease. Some have it, some don't. Why don't some of them not get it? What are those biochemical, those genetic pointers that protect the one and not the other? Why are some alphas totally asymptomatic? Have no lung disease, no liver disease. Those are the ones that you also, I want to bottle that genie. I want to understand that and find those people, and those are the ones that are hardest to find.
One other question that I had is, do you find it's difficult to get people interested in participating in these studies, given the challenges that people face in data entry, showing up at study sites at regular intervals? Is it difficult to get people to join those studies and then retain people in those studies?
I think it's challenging. Yes, again, as we've said, there's so many pressures on a family that's dealing with a rare disorder that it's really important to try to make it as easy as possible for those individuals and communicate back to them as much as possible. But even at that, I mean, day-to-day life sometimes, you know, can be overwhelming. So I think, with these rare disorders, we're kind of a family for a long term. So again, having multiple opportunities for them to come back and you know, participate, maybe they can't participate now, but maybe later, and keeping those possibilities open is really important to maintaining that.
Yeah, I mean, I think about joining the study though, and I delayed a little bit in including my daughter. And in that case, I thought, well, you know, do I want to do this for her? How's she going to feel about it when she's a teenager? How's she going to feel about it when she's an adult? Now, when she turns 18, she needs to consent on her own in order for her information to remain in that database. But ultimately, and especially after hearing you guys talk, she's a great source of data because she's young and she's relatively asymptomatic at this point. And ultimately, knowing that she'd have to consent herself at 18 and that she didn't have to keep data as part of the study if she didn't want to, I did include her. But that was a barrier for me at first.
And we do try to make, you know, as much as you can make it useful for the patient. So you mentioned him, you get the data back that you can share with your medical team. For our families, it's a place to store all of their medical information that they can then print off, you know, all the different specialists they've seen, they can print all that information off and take it to their general practitioner so they have a big picture view. So we try to make sure there's some value back to the patient that will hopefully be helpful to keep them engaged as well.
Right. Our community is motivated, but at the same time, like in the case of my study, it's a 5-year commitment that you're going to be in this study for 5 years and that you will continue to have the kind of testing that we have. It's important, and it will hopefully help research for therapies. But I've had other colleagues who have had also adverse effects, and they're going like, gee, am I going to go back the second year? This was scary for me. That's where the reward, that's where the feedback is so important from the patient advocacy group, helping make it easy. The financial issues are some. I mean, I paid about twice as much as I was reimbursed for the study that I was at. I had to travel halfway across the country, stay in a hotel for a couple of days, taxi cabs you mentioned. But that's where the reward comes in, where the PI feeds back, where patient advocacy groups say thank you to those patients who are doing this work, because it's going to get us closer to a cure for all of these 7,500 rare diseases that we have in this country. And when you add all that up, that's a lot of people across this country who are affected.
Well, I think it's been a terrific discussion. I hope it adds value to people who are watching to understand what natural history studies are, what the challenges are, what the rewards are. And I think there's a lot to be said in all of those areas. And as always, people can contact the FDA, can contact us through our website, or call our office, the Office of Health and Constituent Affairs. Thank you all very, very much for participating.
We hope you found this program to be useful and have learned more about the nuts and bolts of natural history studies, what they are, why they're so critical for effectively developing products for rare diseases, and the important role that patients and patient advocacy groups can play. By working together to build a solid scientific foundation, we can greatly speed the development of products for the many millions of rare disease patients who need them. Thank you.